we also have some pragmatic interests tied up in Egypt. Egypt's been a blocking agent against Iran, part of the blocking coalition that we put together. Egypt's been an ally against al-Qaeda. Egypt has its peace treaty with Israel, and Israel, of course, is a primary interest. And so, since the beginning here, and the Suez Canal, you've seen the president, kind of up on a high wire without a net, juggling these competing priorities. That continues. I agree with Richard. This drama is going to be written by the Egyptians, not by the Americans. Those days are over when we can impose a solution. But we've got some leverage. And if we exercise it, I would say largely privately, behind the scenes, not through Twitter, Facebook, and soapbox statements, we've got $1.3 billion in badly needed aid to the Egyptians. We also have a 30 to 40 year personal relationship between our senior military leaders and Egypt's senior military leaders. So this is where diplomacy kicks in. Can we operate effectively behind the scenes to kind of push these two unlikely actors together, the military and Muslim Brotherhood, and keep them going on some kind of centrist path? It may not work out that way, but that's what American policy should see.
Could I just add one thing on the aid thing? Just 1 second. The 1.3 is military aid. Then there's 250,000, billion in all of these zeros.
Right.
Our government.
Like a true congresswoman, by the way, right?
Thank you, Jeffrey. 250 million in civilian aid and 50 million more in some other kind of special deal. They are in different pots. And just to make this point, Congress conditioned the 1.3 billion on certain benchmarks being reached. Hillary Clinton waived those benchmarks in March, but retained some authority to take it back. I would say that we should give all the civilian aid and plus it up. I think we should condition some of the military aid on the performance of the SCAF.
Richard, you could respond to that if you want. I also want to put this on the table. What would be the consequences of an abrogated Camp David Accord? What would be the consequences if Egypt decides, you know what, we don't have peace with Israel anymore? It doesn't mean necessarily we're going to war, but no peace.
30 on aid, I would condition all the aid. I would basically make it clear, and I would do it with more and more countries, whether it's a Pakistan or Egypt. Blank check, hope for the best aid is a non-starter. And we ought to make it clear what our criteria are. They ought to be reasonable. We want Egypt to succeed. We want Egypt to gradually move in the direction of a greater democratization, of greater market economics. And we ought to use aid to incentivize that. But for example, if there is abrogation of the treaty, which I'll talk about in a second, or there is terrible ill treatment of, say, the 10 million or so Coptic Christians in Egypt and so forth, there ought to be a price for that. It can't be unconditional aid or simply aid in the hope that good stuff happens. It ought to be aid specifically tied to behaviors. If the treaty were to be abrogated, and needless to say, I hope it's not, and I don't think it will be, but if it were to be abrogated, what it would do is essentially reintroduce to the Middle East a level of history that we haven't seen there. To put it another way, from Israel's point of view, Israel has always had three security spheres. It's had a distant sphere, which used to be Iraq and is now Iran, which is the one that preoccupies it most. It's had the sphere of its contiguous neighbors, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, which is the sphere that for several decades was largely quieted since the '73 war in many ways, formally and informally with Jordan and Egypt, informally with Syria, most messily with Lebanon, was largely quieted. And then you had the internal sphere, if you will, the Palestinian one. If you reopen the contiguous sphere, which the Egyptian treaty would do, it would be a transforming moment for Israeli security policy. Israeli strategic planners, who have already begun to hedge a little bit against that possibility, would have to do a lot more than hedge. It would essentially reopen this third strategic arena. For Israel, it would be strategically a terrible development. Psychologically and politically, though, I think it would make it very hard for future Israeli governments to make peace. Because what it would tell them is that we give up things that are real territory in exchange for political promises, but given the political unpredictability of the Arab world, that's a bad trade. So I think it would have repercussions as large as they would be beyond the immediate strategic consequences for Israel and for Egypt.